Welcome to BOMA's Building Excellence, a CRE podcast series. This episode is brought to you by Building Engines. I'm your host, Alan Stein. Our guest today is Aliza Carpio, Senior Director of Technology and Product Manager at Building Engines by JLL. Aliza, thank you for being here. We're excited to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to break the ice before we get into the main conversations, let's do a quick round of rapid fire. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. What's one hairstyle you hope never comes back?
For men, it would be the mullet, and then for women, it's those spiral perms. And I have naturally curly hair, and I always thought it just looked terrible on so many people.
Yeah, I can honestly say it's been 35 years, but I did have a mullet 35 years ago.
Oh,
If you were a
okay,
late
sorry.
night talk show host, who would be your first guest?
If they were still alive, it would be Jimmy Carter. However, my first or second guess would be Michelle Obama.
Love it. Would you rather always be 15 minutes late or 20 minutes early?
I think everyone knows for me, it's going to have to be 20 minutes early.
Yeah. What is a useless superpower that you would actually want?
Um, the superpower to be able to organize closets. You only saw my closet. Like,
I
and
think I
maybe
would
that's
like that
not
as well.
useless, but it's the one that I wish I had.
Yeah. Last question. What's the title of your future memoir?
It's a great question. It would be the space you occupy. And the reason for that is that I was always taught that we are here to be of service, and that is the price that you pay for the space you occupy.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. Personally, for me, it would be You Enjoy Myself, which is a song title for a band that I'm very, very into called Fish. And they
Oh
always
my
they always
gosh.
tell me that their title of that song is right up the alley as to what my life is like. So,
Are you a deadhead also?
yeah, maybe there might be a little deadhead in me. So,
Okay. You and my husband should connect because on our first date, he took me to Fish, didn't know who Fish was.
oh
So
my
took
God,
me up to a concert and I'm like, what is this? And I definitely was a little out of place. So
yeah,
fish out of water.
fish out
No
of
pun,
water. I love it.
no pun
You
intended on that.
you and I are definitely going to catch up on that at that conference in a couple weeks.
Thanks.
So before we jump into the tech talk, can you give us a quick snapshot of your background and how you got started in your current role?
Sure. My background is actually in software engineering, and I am in product management. So I did make a switch early on in my career after 3 years in engineering. My background and that was pretty much in tech. It started off in fintech, but I started in commercial real estate actually when I did a consulting gig for JLL to look at developer processes during COVID, of all things. And that actually started this fascination of the complexity of what problems we were solving, the teams were solving for in commercial real estate. And I thought it was a really interesting space.
Yeah, that's an interesting start and beginning in there. So seeing kind of
Yeah.
both sides of it. So I know you're participating at the upcoming BOMA International Conference as the resident AI expert, and will be spending your time at the Building Engines booth, booth number 1407. What kinds of conversations are you hoping to have with attendees who visit you on the show floor?
I actually hope that they ask all sorts of questions, but when I am in conferences and I show up at the booth, I really enjoy questions around um, can AI solve this? Or how can it solve this problem? I also love questions that are provocative of folks that push on. I don't think AI is right in our space because it's a high touch, not transactional necessarily. It's a high touch industry. And so I love having these conversations to help not necessarily turn people around, but it helps me understand what gets in the way for them, and it helps them understand what opportunities there are that AI could solve or prop tech could solve. So I actually welcome it all, and obviously being in the JLL booth or Building Engines by JLL booth, they're going to be asking questions around Prism, which is our operations platform of what's coming. And there's usually I get a lot of questions are of can I do this? Like can I do X or can I do Y or can it do this for me? So I welcome all, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to get all sorts of questions as well.
All right, well, get ready because I'm going to be swinging by the booth to sharpen up on my AI skills.
Okay, thanks. I'm really excited to meet you in person.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about why conversations surrounding AI are so important. There's an incredible amount of noise and hype out there about AI and LLMs right now. From your perspective, what is the actual reality of AI in our industry today?
I actually really like that you were used the word hype because there's a lot out there. In my workshop that I'm going to be doing on the 29th, I actually have 4 pages of my slides are all around all of these apps and platforms that are available. But let me kind of take a step back in terms of your question around what's the reality. So and so this is kind of crazy, but I'm going to speak from a property management perspective. And the reason why I'm saying this is crazy is because there's been this hockey stick of where AI is going. And there's a huge race right now that I would say where many tech companies are trying to get to that super intelligence. But many of the tools of property managers or property teams are still based in Excel and Outlook. And those were introduced in the late 80s and early 90s. However, since 2023, when ChatGPT was introduced to the world, that hockey stick has of where AI is going, where tech is going, has definitely increased not only the interest but investment. So let me kind of give you a few things. One is I would say 2024 in the industry is actually the start of piloting, and I would say there's been a lot of I don't want to be left behind, so I'm going to go purchase, what everyone else is purchasing, right? So we're seeing like companies purchasing Copilot or, enterprise version of ChatGPT or even Google's Gemini. So there's been a lot of like purchasing, I would say, and a lot of piloting. And what's interesting is when we started going into 2025. So if you think that about 61%, according to some research that was done, about 61% in late 2024 of CRE, commercial real estate industry has been starting to pilot. That actually increased to about 92% in 2025. And there was a study that was done actually by the US Census Bureau with Goldman Sachs. And I don't know if you know this, but the real estate industry is in the top 5 industries that have adopted AI. And by
Hmm.
what I mean adopted, they've invested in it. We're all in the journey of adoption, but it was really fascinating to see that it outpaced other industries like education or even manufacturing. It's really quite fascinating. Now, between 2025 and now, I would say a lot of people are still trying to figure out, am I achieving my goals with this? Can I say that there's like, a return on my investment? And what we found in a recent study that was done actually by JLL on this thing called the Global Real Estate Tech Survey was that yes, 92% of folks are piloting and experimenting, but only like 5% of the industry is saying that it's actually making a difference on their goals. And so that's really telling me and telling everyone else, right? There's a lot, not necessarily hype. Well, you could say there's a lot of investment, but it's really about, okay, can it move the needle on making sure that my buildings are well run or that that I'm actually, making a positive impact on my net operating income. So I do think there's a lot and a lot of folks trying to figure this out and there hasn't been necessarily great measurements or metrics out there and I think people are experimenting. So when people go, "Oh, Lisa, we're no longer experimenting." I'm like, there's still a lot of experimenting and piloting going on. What's actually interesting right now for me in my role is that my team and I do a lot of training around AI. Now, we're not trainers, we're product folks, but what we're seeing is, make it real for me. That's from a property manager or building engineer perspective. There's a lot of these things that I'm being told I need to do, but like, can I use it for this use case, right? Can it abstract leases, for example? Can it like create a draft SOW, a statement of work for me? Can it actually report on my operating expenses without me having to go through all these spreadsheets? So there's a lot of like, can it do this? And so there's a lot around, I would say a lot of focus on saving time. But man, 2026, I think, and I would say next year, there's going to be a lot of focus around, that positive impact on NOI. There's going to be a lot of focus on really how do we measure that return on our investment.
Yeah.
I know
So
I know I said a lot there. I know I
no,
said a
no,
lot.
I mean, you did, but when I think about what you just said, the word that comes to mind, or the phrase that comes to mind is table stakes. And that, so
Yeah.
it's absolutely crucial to the daily operations of these buildings that they start to look at this as no longer an option. It is table stakes in what they do. So when
Yes.
you look at the day-to-day operations of a modern commercial office building, where are the biggest missed opportunities for teams who are hesitating to really adopt this as table stakes?
Yeah, I love that you're actually calling it table stakes because we are, and I call it the compressed era. We are in the era of AI, and yeah, you could say it's the beginning, but man, it's going fast. And with that compressed era where folks don't have your clients or your senior leaders don't have the kind of patience for information or so that they can make decisions and take action with confidence and with speed. There's just little patience for time. And so everything's compressed. And that's why it's such a necessity and such table stakes. So, where I see some things that are missed is actually in the full workflows. So, imagine, if you will, that you need to pay invoices.
Right.
Today, there are property managers out there that have to go to the various sites from their utilities to vendors and grab the invoices, right? And then they put it in a spreadsheet and so that they could see how much am I spending. Then they go through like an approval process of can I spend this? Then they wait for that, and then they get an approval process, and now they have to cut a check. After they cut a check, they now have to email back those vendors and the utility company saying, "Hey, the check is coming." If you think about that whole workflow, right? That spans days. But now AI and other technologies, other platforms can take, for example, could it automate that approval process that can take days of back and forth? That can just automate once you actually initiate the process. And then AI could potentially, you could direct it to potentially go straight to the vendor sites and the different places where you're pulling these invoices. And then it can put it into your spreadsheet that you need for finance folks to be able to approve it. And then it could, then instead of you having to send an email to each one of these vendors, it would, AI could draft it for you. You just have to approve it. And then, either you could choose to send it or it could send it for you. And that can cut out a bunch of days, but it can also cut out a bunch of the follow-ups that teams have to do to make sure that it's moving along in this process that takes many tools and has many processes that are all working in parallel.
Yeah. It's really a great example as to, how that process works. But, I still sometimes get concerned that it sounds like it could be a little potentially intimidating to someone that's not real familiar with it or isn't real comfortable with embracing technology. So if a property manager is in that world, listening to this to our discussion today and feels completely overwhelmed by where to begin with AI, what would be the single best piece of advice that you could give them?
So it's a two-way street on this. An organization cannot require property teams or property managers to go adopt a tool by just looking at it. You've got to show. And so engagement means training and ongoing training. In fact, my team and I conduct quarterly training for for North America, and we have anywhere from 300 to 700 people showing up to our trainings. But it's really showing them here's how you can use it for these specific use cases. There's one. The second is on, like you said, on the property manager or the property team themselves. Folks, the reality is that AI isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And I know there's some folks that are going to be, your early adopters. And then there's some folks that are going to be lagging behind saying, I'm going to wait to see, when it's proven. The reality is that your clients are not waiting. They need those answers. They need those decisions made. So, I am like, I think there isn't a better time to experiment. Try it out. Like, for example, if you have the enterprise version of ChatGPT, start asking it questions. Start like just understanding what it can do for you. But I do think it's it's a two-way street where the organization has to help you get there.
Yeah. It reminds you mentioned that it isn't going away, and I think that's so critical. That actually takes me back to, 1994 in my senior year of college when my advisor took us to the computer lab to show us this new thing called the internet. And she was like, "Yeah, I don't know how long this is gonna be around for, but we were all given the mandate that we had to show you guys, a little bit about how to use it." So,
No, I
yeah.
I love that analogy. I had an uncle that basically thought that the smartphone was just a fad, and he's like, I don't need that, right? Like, that's gonna go away, just like the Betamax." I'm like, sorry, Betamax?
Right. What is called
Beta?
Betamax. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like that went away. I'm like, I don't think so,"
Yeah.
and, it's just interesting because there are people who are still holding on to their landlines, definitely. I mean, I'm not gonna, um, judge you if you have that. I don't have it in my home anymore, but there are people that I would say still do lag behind, and I will say AI is just, and even prop tech isn't gonna go away. I think we have to find ways to help our teams get out of being taskmasters and being more strategic partners that really think about how do you create amazing tenant experiences.
Yeah. That's great. All right, now for a quick word from our sponsor, Building Engines. Building Engines is the operations command center for commercial real estate. It's the single platform where property teams run every task a building needs, from work orders and preventative maintenance to vendor management and tenant experience. Most software gives a snapshot of what's going on in a portfolio. Prism, by Building Engines, gives you control so you can increase NOI. We've spent more than 20 years building operations software that property teams and tenants love. And today, Prism manages over 5 billion square feet across 55,000 buildings. Come find us at the BOMA International Expo in Long Beach, California, and we'll show you what it looks like to run your portfolio from one AI-powered command center. The 2026 BOMA International Conference and Expo is where teams get stronger and problems get solved. Experience the power of connection, learning, and innovation, plus the best expo in the industry. Learn more at 2026.bomaconvention.org. We look forward to seeing you this June in Long Beach, California. So, Lisa, without giving too much away, in your upcoming session on June 29th at the annual conference, you discuss how a successful strategy starts with clean data mandate. If a team wants to automate something like quarterly financial and operational reporting, why is standardizing data formats your first step?
I love this question because let me take you through a recent thing that I did. There was a group that reached out to me at work that said, "Hey, Elisa, this AI feature that y'all built, it's not necessarily giving us the proper information about the square footage in our total portfolio." And I said, "Okay, well, let me take a look." So, we share our screens, and as I'm looking through it, I'm also in the background looking at their data. And I said, "You know what? Let's take a look at what you all actually have entered into this platform." And they're like, "Oh, okay, great." And again, the question was around square footage. When
Yeah.
I looked at their data and we looked at it together, they're sharing their screen, I'm looking with them. There were placeholder square footage information, which means they were putting the number 1 or 10 in there. And so, of course, it's going to skew. So I know people say it's garbage in, garbage out, but it's beyond that, right? So like AI is cannot do its job without the without data being cohesive, organized, and complete. That's the reality of it, right? It's not smarter than human beings. We still need to, and I believe totally in human in the loop in anything that we do. We still have to be the ones to double check it. And so now that group that I just shared with you, they're actually going back to update their data around the building square footage. Um, it isn't just also enough to say that you've got your data in a platform or you've got stuff in there. This whole thing around, and I know this happens in many organizations, not just in the organization I represent, but a building may have a different name or a property may have a different name because somebody, maybe instead of it saying like the peach tree, 2301 peach tree in Atlanta, it might say, just peach tree in Atlanta. And
Right.
so it's missing, a component of that name. And so we need to make sure that when we actually label, like, hey, this is the building name, that we actually look to see, is it consistent as well? And I do see those inconsistencies do impact the kind of results you get, especially when you ask AI to review your portfolio or look into a building. It might miss some of those things. And so a clean data mandate is basically a best practice. It's you could say it's when people say mandate, it sounds like government, but it's
Right.
definitely a best practice that all organizations that are going to go into this journey with AI should really kind of make sure that that is something that is in everyone's mandate, right? We can't have amazing results without amazing foundation. And so that really is about the state of our data and making sure that it best represents and is as complete and as organized as we can make it.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway that our listeners can apply right away, regardless of where they are in their AI journey, is making sure that you're getting that foundational, work in foundational efforts correct before you launch into these some of these initiatives.
Yeah, I've seen things like even the word property is something that AI can misrepresent because in one platform, especially if you're bringing three things together, in one platform, maybe a spreadsheet, it says site, SITE.
Right.
In your operations platform, it might be call it property, and then you're bringing in, let's say, your financial platform, and now it's calling it building. Is that all the same? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And so it really is about the human beings making sure that it starts with good data foundation.
Yeah. Let's shift gears for a moment.
Sure.
With new AI platforms and applications popping up almost daily, it can be
Yeah.
difficult for organizations trying to determine where to invest. How should leadership teams evaluate these vendors and these applications, these opportunities, so they don't end up with a mess of shadow AI?
Do you want me to talk about what shadow AI is? Because I know that's a term that we use in the industry,
Absolutely.
but people are
Yeah.
like, what is that?
Yeah.
Shadow AI is when, let's say, your organization decides to bring in enterprise version of ChatGPT, right?
Hmm.
But you prefer Gemini, Google's Gemini. A shadow AI means it's where where your organization is using tools that aren't um, part of what's approved. So maybe your organization said, we're all using ChatGPT, but on the side, you're like, you know what? I kind of don't like how it does all of my marketing materials for my property. I like Gemini better. Now you're using Shadow AI, which has its own issues around security and privacy because you could be putting data out there and information out there that could be sensitive, but at least in, what is not just required, but what is approved within your organization, we know that that's going to have the guardrails to protect you and to protect the business. Now, with the so many tools, you're so right. I feel like every time I turn around, Lisa, have you heard of this company? I'm like, no, but tell me about it because it does feel like for me, it feels like every week there's something new that I should check out. But my number one thing in terms of evaluating is you start within. which means what problem are you trying to solve? And by problem, what workflows are you trying to improve, optimize, or just even transform? And sometimes even eliminate. So that's where you need to start. And I think many times, because there's the sexiness of a salesperson from that organization saying, it could do this, it could do that. But is that really what you need, right? Maybe what you need is something that focuses on reporting in the essence of maybe I want something that just creates a draft budget. But then this you're in a sales meeting where they're telling you, well, it can kind of do that, but really what we're great at is taking spreadsheets and creating a PowerPoint from it. So you have to really think about how do you balance like, you know, what you're hearing with what your needs are. And you've got to focus on your needs.
Yeah. You, and that makes so much sense is really understanding what is the real need that and using the data to determine what your need is before you just driving in for a solution. So you mentioned building an internal AI center of excellence, so a COE.
Yeah.
Can you break down who needs to be at the table, specifically the roles of, for instance, the executive sponsors, the tech leaders, or the business champions?
Yeah. I think with any change, right? This is a change journey if you are to bring in any new tech, but especially with AI, it's a huge change journey. And you're going to need not just champions for change, but real change leaders and change agents. And so the COE or the Center of Excellence, it's really about, having those change leaders or those change agents, but having kind of a governing body on top of that, like meaning governance, which I know sounds like government, which is kind of scary for some people, or policing, but it's really the people that look out for the needs of the teams, but keeping the business data safe. So in any COE or Center of Excellence, you do need a sponsor. Many times that's a business sponsor. It would be great if it was, because instead of a tech leader being the sponsor, because then it's representing the true needs of the customer, the true needs of the internal team. So you will need an executive sponsor that's going to say, you know what, we're going to invest in this. I'm putting aside money for it. The organization is aligned with the importance of this, right? Because you need almost that captain in that ship. Then you're going to need a tech lead who's most likely going to be pretty high up in the engineering organization. But I've also seen it where it's like sometimes it's a middle manager person who's really in tune with how do you actually drive change and roll out tools. And then you're going to need folks like, engagement champions, people who are actually going to do the training and ensure that your tools that you're bringing in are going to be adopted, and they're going to continue to measure the adoption rate of that. There's also some additional roles that I would say are important, like your business champions. So those are people, if, for example, if your organization has multiple business lines, it's not enough to have an executive sponsor say, hey, we're going to do this. You're going to need some influencers, just like if it's in social, those that are influential in the business to be able to say, this is not just a fad. This is not just a new tool that you should just kind of do on the side. This is the journey we're all going to go in to transform our business. So, and I know there's additional roles in there like program management that you're going to need to ensure that the whole thing kind of comes together and executes well. But I would say those are the key roles to focus on for a COE.
Yeah. Lisa, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. As we wrap up today's conversation, I'd like to close with one final question. And hopefully everyone takes the opportunity to attend your presentation on June 29th out in Long Beach. If there's one key message you'd like the audience to take away from this conversation about moving from AI strategy to real world measurable execution, what would it be?
It's going to go back to asking yourselves, what are we trying to transform? Where are our biggest opportunities in the business that get in a way for property teams or for our business um, to move fast in this compressed era? And when I say move fast, it isn't just about velocity. It's about, at the end of the day, folks, it's about how do we empower people, our teams, to make decisions and take action with speed and confidence with trusted data behind them. So you got to really look at what is the change we're trying to make? And then on top of that, how would we measure that change? And I believe in the love metric. I don't believe in a bunch of metrics. So if you're trying to get people to get rid of some manual processes, maybe the metric there is around time saved. And then so how are you going to balance qualitative and quantitative metric? But think about that one love metric that you all are going to rally against, because having multiple measurements gets messy in terms of trying to understand the true impact of the change you're leading.
Yeah. That's
I hope that makes sense.
that does. I love that you call it a love metric. That makes me wanna channel my inner Barry White, "Ain't got enough of your love, baby." But,
I
on
know
that note,
when I say that, I don't know what people are going to say. So I love the fact that you brought in Barry White.
yeah, well, he is a fan favorite for sure. Elisa, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. We appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure and grateful to be a part of this journey.
Yeah, absolutely, and look forward to seeing you and meeting you in person in Long Beach.
Yes,
Sure,
yes.
that'd
See
be
you
awesome.
there.
Yeah. Well, a big thank you this month to our sponsor, Building Engines, and thank you everyone for listening to BOMA's Building Excellence, a CRE podcast series, where the conversation doesn't stop and the industry keeps moving forward. Until next time, this is Alan Stein, signing off.